Over 60% of breaches start at the human layer.
Grant McCracken is the founder and CEO of Dark Horse Security, an innovative startup that is on a mission to make the world more secure by making it easier to become secure for businesses of all sizes and natures.
Almost every single app that you're going to look at in some way, shape, or form is going to have some vulnerability.
In today's episode, we dive into how to protect yourself, especially in the age of AI, how to protect your business and make sure your employees are not vulnerable to hacks, the most common mistakes people make when it comes to online security, and last but not least, how to start a career as an ethical hacker. Grant, take me back to a moment when you realized that you want to be an ethical hacker.
Oh boy. The moment I realized I wanted to be an ethical hacker was when I wanted a paycheck. It just happened to be the way I got into ethical hacking was I graduated in 2009 and job market wasn't great during the great financial crisis or recession or whatever you want to call it. I was just kind of looking for a job, and a buddy that I used to play video games with, he was like, hey, you could do this. He also found the job. And so he had me apply, and that was with White Hat Security. And so what White Hat had at the time, they kind of had this farm system where they'd take people that had all different kinds of backgrounds and they teach them to be ethical hackers. And obviously that was for profit and we did it for the business and whatnot. But there was no, I want to be an ethical hacker type moment, right? There was no, oh, that's the career I want. I went to school for communications. So I thought I was going to work in marketing or HR or something like that. I did not. I was not planning on getting into ethical hacking, and that's just kind of how it shook out.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Like how many of us actually plan to do the exact thing that you're doing now? Probably 2% or
Very
something
few.
like that.
Yeah.
But for those that are not aware, what does an ethical hacker do on a daily basis?
Just about what it sounds like. They hack, but ethically. The industry term is usually going to be like a penetration tester. Basically, the idea of a penetration test is that you're trying to penetrate systems, whether those be human systems, whether those be networks, whether those be applications, APIs, web apps, mobile apps, all that stuff. And you're just trying to penetrate those systems. Now, there's different layers to kind of what you do there. Sometimes it's a little deeper, sometimes it's more surface level. But fundamentally, you're just looking for vulnerabilities in whatever put in front of you, right? Again, whether that's an application, some sort of host that's on a network, or we can even go into like configuration reviews, right? If you're testing somebody's like AWS configuration or O365 config, stuff like that.
And speaking of apps and web apps and so on, what are the most common security breaches that you encounter in your career?
To draw a little distinction, right? When you hear breaches in the news, what they're typically referring to is like an organization's already been breached. So somebody's already exfiled records or something to that effect. So usually not involved in breaches unless you're on kind of the forensic side of the house. Vulnerabilities could become a breach if they were exploited by a bad actor. Some of the more interesting ones, right? I mean, you see all sorts of crazy stuff. For instance, the really powerful stuff as it relates to like anecdotes and whatnot is like things like code execution, right? So you get dropped on a network and you find a vulnerability in some machine that's running on that network, and you're able to just take over that machine and you can do whatever you want with it, right? And you could install whatever software you want on it. And this is effectively how you kind of get to malware and other things. But you could also, what you'll do as a hacker is you'll also use that machine as a foothold. So sometimes if you're coming in from the outside and you're able to compromise an external machine, you can use that machine, once you take over that machine, to then take over other machines inside of the network and so on and so forth. Anyway, obviously code execution is like a really interesting type of vulnerability. It's relatively rare, but when you get it, it feels amazing because you're just like, I've got complete control over this machine. There's other things where, again, depending on how far you go within the pen test, where you can go even further than that and try to get domain admin and be able to control not just the machine, but like the network or all the users within the organization. So levels to that type of compromise. But another one that's really fun is like SQL injection. Not sure if you're familiar with the idea of SQL, but most databases are written in some sort of language, right? You say, grab the user user where username equals this certain thing and whatever else you want to attach to it. And so there's all these queries. When a web page makes that, or an application makes a query, sometimes they don't do it in a safe way, and you can actually inject into that query, and that's called SQL injection. And you can basically do whatever you want with the database as well. So you could pull all the information from the database. And this is where if hackers are able to retrieve passwords or account details and stuff like that, it's often a function of a SQL injection type vulnerability, though there's other ways of getting that information, not the least of which being at the human layer. And over 60% of breaches start at the human layer. Some of the really impactful breaches are often as simple as like exploiting a human to get Debbie in finance to send you some PDF of information that obviously shouldn't leave the organization just because you were able to social engineer them into thinking that you were IT and you needed that, or you're the CEO or something to that effect. So again, there's a lot of different really interesting types of vulnerabilities and kind of ways that they're exploited looking for.
Yeah, that's actually what I was looking for, because I want to see how we can protect those listening from this vulnerability. The last one I think is very powerful, because indeed, to different methods, people can be incentivized to do something that they don't even realize that they're not sending to the right type of person. And how that usually happens, if you can share, and how we can protect ourselves from not sending the wrong email to the wrong person, or the answering to the wrong message on our phone, and so on.
Sure. At the individual level, there's a couple really basic things that you should be doing, right? So there's a number of different ways that these exploits can happen wherein they're able to attack an individual. Everybody's got a phishing email, phishing text messages, stuff like that. And then there's also this idea of cred stuffing is the official attack terminology for it, where you go look at a past breach, and it's public information. It's just out there. It's on like Pastebin kind of thing, where there's all these usernames and all these passwords from past breaches. And you just say, okay, I'm going to go try that on some website. And so you throw them all at some organization, right? So I'm just coming up with an example, but within that list of credentials, you might be able to find that somebody registered with a work email or something like that. Or you're able to tie that email back to that user, and then you try to log into their work accounts with the same password that they use. So again, that's like a cred stuffing account, where you just take all the passwords that have historically been associated with an account, and you see if you can get those to work again. That's fairly routinely in the news. There was a very recent Australian one where that was an issue, where cred stuffing, they got into people's retirement accounts and stuff like that. So one of the first things you could do as a user is just not use the same password over and over again. How you do that is you just use a password manager. It's very hard to remember every single different passwords. People probably have 2 or 3 passwords that they use, and then they just use those same passwords and maybe slightly different combinations over like a billion websites, right? And so if it gets popped on one of those websites and they're able to find it, then they can potentially get into anywhere else it's used. So using a password manager, LastPass, 1Password, any of those, that's one of the quickest and easiest things that you can do to protect yourself as a user. 2, in using multifactor authentication is essential, because even if they're able to get your password and your username, and they get both those things correct, if you have multifactor on your account, they're not going to be able to get in, right? It's going to say, okay, now give us the one-time password. And they're like, well, I don't have that. And they're going to move on. There is some data that says doing multifactor over SMS is less secure, right? It is possible to do SIM swapping and stuff like that. Don't super recommend SMS, but if it's all you've got, SMS is still an order of magnitude better than not using anything at all. You're still going to protect yourself a lot. So that's kind of how you can protect yourself from just a wide swath of attacks out the gate. And then obviously the layer on top of that is just being skeptical and being critical. I think in today's kind of misinformation and disinformation age, it's essential to question literally everything at this point, for better or worse. There was, those lawmakers got shot in Minnesota. The guy showed up saying he was police. Even that, you should question. Police show up at your door, you got to call 911 and be like, hey, actually supposed to be police at my door. Should I open? Should I talk to these people? Yeah, just question everything.
Especially now in the age of AI, we can receive phone calls that sounds like our family members, or even video messages or similar, and can be scary. And in the same time, the advice that you give is so valid, because unfortunately, a lot of people are still using the same password across multiple accounts, or Even worse, like saving them in a plain document on their computer or whatever. And that leads us to basically the first example that you gave, when others get access to your own device. And obviously, most of us see these in movies, like the recent one, Mission Impossible, in which those kids were taking control over someone else's laptop and grabbing some information, photos from there, and so on. And from those type of attacks, what are the solutions and advice that you have to give to those that are listening that, oh my God, I need to protect myself because you never know?
Yeah. Again, it's not going to be the super fanciest advice. It's kind of doing the fundamentals. The first one is just keep your machine up to date. Your Chrome browser or whatever browser you're using, you'll notice in the upper right-hand corner, it'll every couple days or weeks, it'll say update, and it'll be green at first, and then it'll be yellow, and then it'll be red. And at some point, it'll force you to update. So keeping your browser up to date, your OS up to date, your phone up to date, everything up to date. You'll see all the time when you do these things, if you look at the patch notes or whatever, it'll be like, oh, fixing security bugs or whatever. And so you may not ever know what those bugs were, and maybe they were being exploited in the wild, maybe they weren't, right? But every now and then, people have released something called zero-click vulnerabilities, and then there's one-click vulnerabilities where you still have to engage in it, but one click will kind of give them code execution. They're really hard to pull off, and they're really expensive, but nation state level people kind of have access to who knows what at this point. But keep your devices updated. Keep all your software updated as well. When I'm on a network and I'm trying to break into a machine, what I'm looking at is what's running on that machine. And 9 times out of 10, right, when you're going to get code execution or something like that, it's because they're running some vulnerable piece of software that is outdated. Most software isn't like vulnerable and it's just vulnerable forever, right? There's like newer versions of it where they like patch those vulnerabilities, and somebody's just running some old FTP server or something that they just don't need to be running, or that they never updated, or it hasn't been kept up to date, and that creates vulnerability. That's just a really big one. It's just making sure that you keep those things up to date. The second one on there is don't run or execute things that you shouldn't be running or executing. That's, again, just just common sense kind of stuff, but you'd be surprised how uncommon common sense is, right? I guess in the real world, I mean, just kind of what we run into all the time. If people did things that were common sense all the time, there'd be far fewer breaches and stuff of that nature. Again, be skeptical of anybody that is asking for information, and obviously confirm it before you do anything. Never give out passwords, never give out one-time use passwords or the OTP codes or anything like that. And then don't install random stuff on your machine. It's just generally a bad idea. And doing all those things will, again, mitigate for a significant portion of things. But if the NSA wants to get onto your laptop, they're probably going to figure out how. We probably don't have a prayer against them, but against less sophisticated actors, because they've probably got a stockpile of 0 days and stuff like that. Every once in a while, you'll hear about law enforcement struggling to get into someone's iPhone, and the local law enforcement doesn't have access to the tools that like the NSA or higher order organizations probably do. Again, I don't know what they're capable of, but I just assume they're capable of getting into whatever they want, whenever they want.
Indeed, security agencies, or how they're called, they might have access. And if you look back at Snowden, for example, the amount of information he revealed and so on about how NSA and others are having access to our devices and such. But for the day-to-day users, the people that are afraid that someone else will take over, apart from the advices that you give, do you think there are other solutions? Like, for example, certain operating systems or certain devices are more secure than others, or security software that we can install on our computers, like an antivirus or malware protector or any of that?
I'm hesitant to make any recommendations around like additional software layers. So there are these machines do a decent job these days of, whether it's Mac, whether it's Windows or anything, they do a relatively decent job. When you try to run an application, it'll be like, hey, this application is trying to access like XYZ. Do you want to allow it access? They tend to do a decent job there. I personally don't run antivirus or anything to that effect. I'm not sure that it's still relevant. I'm sure it is in some sense. On average, I would just recommend practicing the fundamentals: strong passwords, multifactor, just good like operational security as it relates to your devices. Don't just leave your devices unlocked all over the place, whether that be your phone or whether that be your laptop. Don't install random plugins, because a lot of these plugins, when you add a plugin, it'll be like, oh, it can read like everything you're doing. And so you got to be really careful in terms of what has access to which things and whatnot. But on average, again, if you practice those fundamentals, are skeptical to a reasonable degree, then again, I think you're going to have your bases fairly well covered.
So that's with individuals, but when it comes to companies that usually involve so many individuals that obviously they have their own devices, they have the work device as well, they might browse their company accounts from their personal device and so on. How can one business protect their assets from such security breaches in a sustainable way, basically?
Sure. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the same things we were talking about at the user level, making sure your software is up to date, making sure that your users aren't installing or doing nefarious things. If you're an organization, the stat I gave earlier, 60% of breaches start at the human layer, right? So if you make sure that your human layer is not just easily exploited by phishing attacks or other similar mechanisms, you're eliminating a wide swath of potential like exposure as an organization. Secondary to that, you want to make sure that you understand all your different assets, what's on your network, what domains you own, what's going on where, especially in the age of AI and vibe coding. People are just like creating their own tools all the time. And are these secure? Maybe not. And so are you like plugging that into like production data? So you want to make sure that you have a real good sense of what has access to what is important to your organization, what do you need to be able to protect, and then ensuring that that's not just exposed to everything out there. You want to know what's on your network again, because I've talked to different CISOs or people, they come into these organizations that are legacy organizations. They're super old and they've just been doing business forever, and they start looking around and there's just like my favorite story is there's like a Raspberry Pi just like hanging off the wall attached to an Ethernet cable, and like it just says don't unplug. And so what do? Nobody knows what it does. So do you unplug it or do you not unplug it? Like how do you manage work with that? So you're just having a good disposition around or characterization around where your exposure is. And then obviously the next layer down is assessing that exposure for vulnerabilities, right? So that's doing things like penetration tests, testing your applications, testing your networks, making sure that you have somebody come in with a security perspective and try to identify vulnerabilities. So those would be like kind of three things I'd say organizations should be doing at a bare minimum in terms of trying to make sure that they're more secure.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when it comes to managing their employees, right? Because at the end of the day, if you don't educate them, it's so hard for them to know actually these common practices that you mentioned. For most people are not something they're aware of. And for example, in my own industry, I used to build websites, and most of the websites back in the day were building tools like WordPress and so on. And often I had this long educational period in which I had to educate my clients that of the importance of keeping their plugins up to date, the core website, WordPress up to date, and so on. Because most come from this perspective that, oh, it will never happen to me until it happens. And then your own reputation and much more, sometimes money and so on, can be lost. And that's just one piece of the discussion. But when it comes to the more complex things, like for example, when a client approaches your business, Dark Horse to come into play and help them secure their applications or their businesses, what do you guys exactly do?
Yeah, so specifically what we offer primarily at Dark Horse is vulnerability assessments, penetration tests, bug bounties, and vulnerability disclosure programs. So it's one of those things. When they're coming to us, right, we're going to help them with one of those. Now, if they have a larger macro picture around what should we be doing, we can have a conversation around that and try to help them understand their exposure and make kind of a similar recommendation to the conversation we're having in terms of, okay, so what are your assets? Okay, well, let's take a look at your assets. Okay, what's important to you? Okay, if it turns out that there's this one area that like has all of your most important information, maybe we focus there first, right? And then we'll go pen test that or something like that. They typically come to us and they say, hey, we need to pen test, get a vulnerability assessment, a bug bounty, a vulnerability disclosure, whatever it is. They want to set it up and they want to identify the vulnerabilities against a specific target. So then we say, okay, well, let's talk about the target. Let's understand the scope. Let's understand what we should test, what we shouldn't be testing, what your goals, objectives are. And then we leverage a tester to go perform that work. And then they get the vulnerabilities in the platform. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were looking for.
Yeah, because I really want to understand the process, since a lot of people that run businesses, especially small businesses, they are like, oh, why should I protect because I'm secure. Like, I just have my social media accounts. I maybe run a website. I might have some internal CRMs and stuff. And let's say they have as well a small app that it's public. But in terms of problems that can arise in that type of environment, some of them you already mentioned. But apart from that, from someone getting access to those, let's say, database that they have of the clients and so on, or getting login credentials and sending email in the name of one of their colleagues and so on, what other things they should be aware of, and how important it's actually to protect your assets through a specialized company like yours?
Sure. So, I mean, my first answer is it's absolutely critical, right? For every organization. Of course, I'm going to say that because that's my belief. But more than that, I've been doing this for 13 years. Very rarely do you ever get an application that doesn't have vulnerabilities. Very rarely. So almost every single app that you're going to look at in some way, shape, or form is going to have some vulnerability. And it happens. It even happens to the security organizations. It's not uncommon for security organizations to have vulnerabilities. So if you go look at, say, for instance, BugCrowd or HackerOne, their bug bounty platforms, and again, I used to work at BugCrowd, you can see on their bug bounty program, they pay out their bug bounty program. They pay out for vulnerabilities all the time. So people are finding vulnerabilities in security companies' software. So you probably have vulnerabilities in your software. What you might be asking for is, what are some of the different attack vectors that attackers could use? There's a ton of different stuff that people can do, right? For instance, one of the really most common vulnerabilities out there is something called cross-site scripting. And that's where you can inject your own script onto a web page. Now, one of the most famous examples of this, and this just kind of shows how things haven't always, just because technology progresses doesn't mean we get rid of the vulnerabilities. So like the most famous example of a cross-site scripting vulnerability was like, do you remember MySpace?
Yes.
Yeah, you remember like the Sammy worm where like it just infected everybody's profile? That's an example of what you could potentially do with cross-site scripting. With cross-site scripting, you can, and again, browsers are becoming increasingly powerful, right? In terms of just like the scope of what they can and can't do. If you have cross-site scripting on somebody's page, you can rewrite the page content, you can redirect the user, and you can have the browser do whatever you want it to do, because again, it just reads, if it sources in your script, again, it doesn't care if the script that it's executing is coming from you or it's coming from the person who wrote the web page. Your browser doesn't know the difference. It's just kind of doing what it's told, right? It's just a computer. And so you can do any number of things with cross-site scripting. Some other more interesting asset or vulnerability classes include something called insecure direct object references. That's called an IDOR. Say you go to checkout, and after you check out, it's like confirmation number 1234. And then when you say, oh, what happens if I put 1233? And it shows you somebody else's confirmation information. Oh my, like suddenly I have access to, now I can just go 1232. And like I get somebody else's confirmation, and it's potentially got their address on it. And I mean, I found something like this. Just, I was doing something for my dog. And so you have to upload like vet records or whatever to the site. And I was like, huh, that's weird, this number. And so I just tried one number higher, and sure enough, I'm able to get somebody else's vet records. And so I sent it to the company. I was like, hey, you got a vulnerability here. But vulnerabilities, they're all over the place. I could talk for hours about the different vulnerability classes and what that potentially enables an attacker to do. Anyway, so like you as a person that is running a small app, I would bet money that they've got vulnerabilities somewhere in there. That's why you need to make sure that you're securing your assets no matter what. And even more so in the age of AI, whether you built it with AI or you're just leveraging AI via chatbot or some sort of integration or something like that, plenty of opportunity for abuse. AI has just introduced a bunch of new vulnerabilities, right? Not the least of which being prompt injection. That's a vulnerability. You've heard of like prompt manipulation or stuff like that, but like prompt injection, it's the same thing. It's like, you just get it to tell you things it shouldn't tell you, kind of SQL injection or something like that. So a ton of different vulnerabilities. It's unlikely that when building an application, you're able to like really account for all these things. Cause I know building Dark Horse, right? As I was going through and writing it, I'd catch myself sometimes. I'd write something and I'd be like, oh my, that could be a vulnerability. I could see how that could be, and it can get convoluted. It's, oh, like under this condition, this person has access to this thing, but unless it gets revoked, or, and then you need some sort of revocation process and all this other stuff that not everybody thinks through all the time. And so again, I'll just stop right there, but hopefully that's enough.
No, but it's very important to bring that awareness because indeed there are so many ways apps or businesses can get exposed by these vulnerabilities. And especially this one that you repeatedly mentioned with coding with AI or using AI tools in different ways, especially to help you code things, or vibe coding that you mentioned, like using apps. I won't mention them, but using those third-party apps that are helping you build basically overnight an app, that's not really production ready. So at least not for now. And that's really dangerous because indeed, if you put that out there, and you might end up in trouble. And still people will say, all right, but instead of spending a couple of 10,000, 20,000 grand to get a minimal viable product, I'll just use another app to test that out. What would be your advice to those people?
Yeah, I mean, go for it. For one, right? Don't stop innovating. Just also get security testing. So you can build at the speed at which you need to build, but make sure you're securing it. Make sure you have someone from a security perspective taking a look at it. That's part of what Dark Horse really offers. What Dark Horse is all about is providing access to smaller organizations. In the wild, penetration tests typically cost a ton of money. And what we've done at Dark Horse is we tried to make them as affordable as possible while still providing access to high quality talent and so forth. My recommendation is still, you got to test it. I mean, you can build as quick as you need to, right? You don't not use those tools. Be skeptical. Don't just trust it at face value. And don't just push code that AI generates to production. You want to make sure that you're personally reviewing it. And then again, also make sure that there's some sort of security review in your pipeline as well.
Yeah, that's interesting because, for example, I played with one of the tools and I expressly said at some point, is this code actually safe enough to put into production? And after the tool reviewed it, I was like, oh, I apologize for that. There's actually a security vulnerability here that I need to address. But probably if I would go again and ask again, maybe they'll find another one and so on. So it's convenient to see that you have all this power to write code by just talking to a tool, but in the same time, without having that extra layer of security of a third-party solution like Dark Horse or similar to come into play and actually make sure that the code that you put out there is secure.
The importance of expectations cannot be understated. And this goes in all aspects of life. It's the result of a mismatch in expectations. So when you think about things in that frame, it really, and you're able to get ahead of a lot of potential issues, right? So if a client's unhappy because they expected things to go a certain way, if you expected it to break, you're not going to be that upset. You're like, oh, well, I kind of expected it to break. But if you don't expect something to break and it breaks, then you're going to be pretty upset about that. So if you can manage the expectations successfully and effectively, you're able to kind of avoid a lot of potential frustrations. And again, this holds true with managing employees. It holds true with working with your boss. It holds true with romantic relationships, friends, business, whatever. Managing those expectations and saying, okay, this is what's going to happen. This is what I expect to happen. What do you expect to happen? Oh, shoot, you expect something different to happen. Okay, let's like reset expectations. Now we go into this thing aligned. Now we're going to have less probability of friction later on down the line. So just managing expectations, I think, has been probably one of the most powerful things for me in my career.
Totally agree. Yes, when you're on the same page, expectation wise, either with anyone we are involved with, like all the examples that you mentioned, it's so much easier to arrive at the desired outcome rather than everyone has different expectations, different desires, and so on. And it's impossible then to please everyone. And also, on that note, that doesn't mean that we should not aim for the best or should not dream big and so on, but managing those expectations is so important. And on this path or career advice, if someone want to enter this space of security, especially nowadays, where they should start?
I would say Hack the Box or Portswigger Labs. Hack the Box is a more complete platform. So that's kind of where I typically direct people. But yeah, you can just set up an account for free and you can just start working on their basic challenges. And they've got challenges that'll take you in any direction you want to go. You want to go into bounty hunting, you want to go into pen testing, you want to go into blue team, red team. Hack the Box is just a great place to start to kind of get your feet wet, to kind of learn the basics. Portswigger Academy is another one where Portswigger makes a tool called Burp. Burp is the industry standard as it relates to a proxy. Proxy is what you're typically using when you're attacking a web application. So they have a lot of great content on there. There's Pentester Labs. There's a bunch of other resources. There's no shortage of information out there. But if you're just picking one place to start, I'd say Hack the Box.
Nice. Thanks for sharing that. And speaking of sharing, if those that are listening resonate with what you share and want to work with Dark Horse, where they can reach out to?
Yeah, the website is darkhorse.sh. So you can just go there and hit the contact button and you'll get in touch with somebody. You can also email me directly at grant@darkhorse.sh. And then you can also find me on LinkedIn, right? My name's Grant McCracken. If you search Grant McCracken Dark Horse, probably going to be the only one that pops up. You can find me there as well.
Awesome. And I'll put the links down below in the show notes as well. You're dropped in the middle of a new city, let's say in the wilderness of the city, and you just have at your disposal one piece of advice that you gather in all your career. And that's the only thing that you can leverage to start over again. What that will be?
I want to say it's a little bit of a mind hack, but ask yourself what a person with high agency would do. Because we tend to think of ourselves constrained, right? So if I get dropped into a city, a fresh environment, and I've just got to go figure it out, the main thing that's going to help there is a mindset that is looking for solutions. You're looking for a way to be successful. And like the human mind is really good at finding like negatives, right? So we're really good at finding reasons why we won't be successful. But being able to put yourself in a state of mind where you could say, okay, if I had an incredible amount of agency, what would I be doing? Just as a thought exercise, it opens up a lot of doors, as it were. It depends on what the goal is, right? So let's just say the goal is to make like enough money to live off of. We're not trying to make $1 million, but you could apply the same concept to $1 million. I could go knock on every single door. I could go wash cars. I don't know. I'm not doing a very good job of representing this right now, but it's opening your mind up to not be constrained by what you think that you're capable of and just being like, okay, what are all the potential options? What would somebody that just makes things happen do in this situation? And that will unlock opportunities mentally that you just wouldn't have before. If you're just saying, okay, I am this sort of person and I do this specific thing, you're going to be a little more constrained by that. Whereas somebody that says, I'll do whatever it takes to accomplish this objective, they're a little less constrained and able to find a way to get where they're trying to go. Does that make sense? Am I making sense?
So it actually makes perfect sense. And speaking of knocking on doors, you can actually do exactly that, right? Asking those that have high agency and see them succeed, like what they're actually doing on a daily basis, how they're taking action constantly on certain things. And I think that's very underrated advice because often we think, oh, we should focus on that. But being high agency, especially nowadays when distraction is all over the place, it's such an underrated skill to master. And that's powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah. You know what high agency is. So sorry. Sometimes you say agency or high agency and people are like, what? And so you obviously know what it is. So maybe I could have just said high agency is the best advice, or develop the scale of high agency.
Yeah, going to details like you did, you make those that are not aware of the term to realize what exactly is that. And that's the thing that I was looking out from you, and you didn't disappoint. So thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you so much for joining me today. It was a pleasure to have you.
Cool. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.